I'm Nicole Cropper. For folks that don't know me, I'm really excited to be here. And first and foremost, let me just say thank you for the support. I think it's really important for us to build our learning communities, as Amal would say, and support each other. So really, from the bottom of my heart, I really appreciate you. I am here to talk about centering equity and operationalizing justice. And I'm going to start a little by first kind of talking about why I decided to do this project. I work at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'm in charge of embedding equity into all of our activities. And when I first started, I was like, well, this is a big nebulous concept. What does that even mean? What do we mean by equity? What do we mean by justice? And so what I realized in talking to a lot of my colleagues is that no one really had any idea on what that looked like, right? Folks were like, well, does that mean recruitment? Does that mean in our resources? And so I wanted to kind of take a broad, big picture look at what embedding equity looks like. And so from kind of the research that I've done, literature reviews that I saw, a lot of the work really needs to start internally. So doing your own, like looking at your hiring practices, for example, celebrating the diversity within your organization. And so you'll see kind of when I get to my framework part that you'll see that kind of reflected in the recommendations. And so this project is really supposed to be a desk guide. Like, here, you administrator, you're in charge of embedding equity. Here are a few tools to do that. So first and foremost, I wanted to say that with any framework, it is really, really incredibly important to always reflect, right? Embedding equity is not just a process. It is not linear at all. There are lots of things that make it incredibly complicated. And so I really wanted to start in this desk guide with, you have to always reflect, you have to always check in with both external organizations, parties, folks that you're working with, but also internally. How are folks feeling? How is the process working? And then kind of pivot, once you've checked in, there's nothing wrong with saying this isn't working. Let's start it again. And then last and certainly not least, act on those changes, right? Don't just say this isn't working. You have to actually do something. And so you'll see that peppered all throughout these frameworks. Before I actually get into the individual frameworks, I wanted to maybe provide a framework for the frameworks. So I presented them. I developed 3 separate frameworks, all informed by professionals in the industry, Sarah Rubin included, who's in the room from the Department of Conservation. And I wanted to kind of break it up into chunks, kind of based off of kind of what your position was within the organization. And so the first framework is really high level and really meant for kind of state leaders, right? You are the visionary, you're kind of the strategist. And so you'll see that some of the actions here are going to be really broad and really focus on like what specific equity principle is that you're looking to achieve. And so let's say you're an organization that doesn't really engage with the public, for instance, maybe you're only looking at internal equity and, where do you have actions that will be incorporated. The second framework really looks at, or is looking at kind of that mid-level, mid-manager level. So those are the folks that are probably developing the plans or developing the projects, but they're not actually doing the implementation. And so those actions will be a lot more detailed, but not super in the weeds detailed. And then the last framework is really where the details will be. I didn't kind of put it in my presentation because that was way too much for our purposes here, but I just wanted to provide kind of that outline of the frameworks. So since I already kind of went through that one, I'm going to skip that. All right. So the second framework is really looking at kind of if you're doing any sort of planning for equitable activities, internally or externally, what are the steps that you need? And then kind of what activities what activities are applicable to these steps? And so looking at, if you're developing a plan, for example, if you're planning, you're going to really start thinking in the beginning, what does equity look like within the planning process? If you're looking to do kind of an implementation activity, so that's like on the ground project on a reserve, for example, you're going to kind of look at all of these activities, and that's going to make the most sense for that activity. And so I really wanted to have those mid-level managers be able to tease out, like, here's this project, here are the steps that are applicable to this project. And again, these are all based off of other frameworks that have been developed previously. but specifically kind of tailored towards natural resource organizations. I maybe should have clarified that in the beginning, that this desk guide is really for natural resource organizations, specifically because there's not been, I think, a lot of conversation of what equity looks like in the conservation space, right? It's a very, very non-diverse space. It's getting much better, but it's not diverse. And I don't think that a lot of kind of practitioners are really actively thinking about what kind of equity in conservation looks like. A lot of the kind of background information specifically for this one was really pulled from, there's a practice called implementation science in health science. And so they look at, how do you change health behaviors, health-related behaviors. And so there are several hundred frameworks on how you do that. And so I pulled a lot of the information from kind of those practices that were already kind of vetted and embedded into the health space. And this framework is the juiciest. This one is for practitioners on the ground looking to either be street level bureaucrats, as I'm going to keep pointing at them all because I just finished his class up. But, folks who are on the ground talking to people, really engaging with folks and with these issues kind of one-on-one with community members. And this one is really, I think, the most robust plan. So leadership is likely this is probably not going to be applicable to them because they're not as in the weeds. This framework is in 4 steps, and you will also see the kind of let's check in all the time as part of the pie. But it really starts with like exploring and assessing. So what is your baseline? What is your internal baseline? What does, diversity look like internally? What does your recruitment look like internally? How do you celebrate diversity internally? So really gathering those metrics and those activities so you understand what it even looks like, right? And then kind of as you go along through the phases, you can better develop kind of programming that fits into those or that better addresses kind of those activities that you already outlined. And so I did want to kind of just share a little bit example of what this last framework looked like. And so you'll see, for example, in this, I'm going to put on my little teacher voice here. You'll see in this, in this section, for example, is like, it's very internally focused. So you're looking at developing your, JEDI working groups, for example, and having folks really participate in that kind of planning process. And then really like looking at strategies. So what's your internal recruitment plan? Do you need environmental justice or equity related policies? And what does that process look like? And then so on and so forth. And so I just wanted to kind of provide a little bit example of what kind of those really discrete actions would look like, because I think those details are really important for staff, because I think, as I said earlier, a lot of people just don't know, they don't know where to start. And I think, giving folks at least an idea of where to start will help us do better. Okay, and so I felt in my project anyways, I would be really remiss not to address resistance, especially in the equity space, folks, and it's because it's so politicized right now. Folks are a little scared to talk about equity, right? Or really hesitant to get into that space, into those conversations, or just don't think it's a big deal. I think certainly where I work, folks are really focused on the species management, wildlife management, fish and wildlife, period. And, I certainly have heard personally, we deal with fish and wildlife. We don't deal with people. So we don't need to think about equity, which, blows my mind, but it's, it's very true. And so I thought, dealing with resistance was really important to address here, because it's inevitable, especially when we're talking about kind of some of these more politicized topics. And so in this project, I kind of wanted to identify the 5 stages of grief. Because a lot of that resistance will kind of look like that. No, I don't want to do this. It's kind of changing my worldview or the way that I do my work. And then kind of looking at, what are strategies that folks can use to deal with that resistance? I think first and foremost is just acknowledging that this is really hard, and that, I don't know that there's a way to get it right, but we can try, right? And that it's okay to not get it right, as long as the intent and you're doing it in good faith. And so as I was kind of thinking through how to deal with resistance and thinking through kind of my own personal experience, I thought, first and foremost, my allies have been my rock. One, because this work is so hard and can be kind of isolating, and having the community of folks around you that can help support the implementer, right, the practitioner, was really important. And so I did acknowledge that in this project, but also, right, who are your supporters? Who are the folks at all levels that are really going to be the champions? Because it's impossible for one practitioner to be in all the rooms and all the spaces, but it is more possible when you spread the love, right? Like let's bring a few people who already get it, who are already doing this work in their own work, and have them kind of help us uplift the entire organization. I think I also really thought that it was important, and again, this was really supported through the research, is really transparency. I think, it's a struggle sometimes when you're talking about equity. You want to, make promises that you can't keep. And I think it's really important, especially for state organizations, to just be honest, right? We got it wrong. We're trying to do better. We may not be able to get where you want to go, but let's try together. I mean, it really is that simple, and we make it so incredibly much more challenging than that. And so in the framework I did outline, or excuse me, in the desk guide, I did outline kind of what are different ways that you can kind of deal with that resistance. And then last but not least, and this is something that's really near and dear to my heart, is just celebrating our successes, right? Again, this work is hard. A lot of people are already grappling with these issues and have literally no idea that they're engaged in equity work. And so I think I wanted to make sure that I acknowledged that in the project and connected those dots. And so I say, let's celebrate. And I will conclude with that. I welcome any questions. I hope at least one person asks a question, because this is like my jam and I love to talk about it.
Hi there. So in the fish and wildlife space, what does success look like in equity?
Thank you. So I think in the fish and wildlife space specifically, equity looks like folks are coming to our commission meetings and chiming in all of our regulatory activities. It looks like us providing educational and access opportunities. We own and manage over 1 million acres of land in the state and all of the oceans like 3 miles out. And so that's a lot of space that we can engage in. And we are the quote unquote, science experts on a lot of those species. And I think just bringing the community into those spaces. I would also say for the department, we are an incredibly white organization. When I started, we were about 92% white, which, makes me cringe inside, but it's the reality of the situation. And so I think just, I would love to see us look around the room, look at our leadership team, and it not look the way that it does currently.
Great presentation. And I think this is a perfect segue into my question. And forgive my frankness. I don't really know.
Say it. Just say it. Let's get in there. I love
it. Let's talk about racialized equity labor. If the Fish and Wildlife Department is 92% white and Nicole is doing equity,
you are speaking my language.
Frankly, I see that a little bit as problematic. Do you see that as a problem in your work? And how might you advise an administrator who is also a person of color and in a 92% white organization?
I think that's where kind of your supporters really come in. Yes, to everything that you said, it is incredibly problematic. I do have to say we have to start somewhere though, right? And unfortunately, right, I am the only person of color in my leadership team, and it is awkward all of the time. And I wish that wasn't the case, but that's just the reality. But I've built up a great network of folks, Sarah, like other folks that I have, started to work with. And when I have hard days, I can call them. I have cried at work. It's been a mess, but I think specifically having those supporters, and I would advise administrators, if you're looking to hire someone to do this work, you need to have the support system. You need to be this part of the support system, but you need to make sure they have the infrastructure and the support they need. I think I would also say in that space, there are not a lot of resources dedicated to people doing this work, right? The expectation, rightfully so, I think it's for everybody within the organization to be doing it. The reality though is not everyone is on the same level, education-wise, understanding, etc. And so I do think it's important to have folks that are trained and engage in this work more often than not. So I would provide that as another recommendation.
Okay. First of all, shout out Griffin, racialized equity labor. Okay, this is going to be So as I was looking through sort of the frameworks and the frameworks on frameworks, I was struck by how broad, almost general they were, in the sense that doing equity work, or at least managing equity initiatives, is almost good management. Like you could almost Mad Lib
120%.
you could almost Mad Libs a lot of, right, take equity out and put like tech innovation in,
Sure
or take,
can.
right?
Sure
And I
can.
just want like, what part of this do you think is specific to, or won't work in the context of other kinds of change initiatives?
That's a great question. What wouldn't work? I think with equity work specifically, and perhaps this is necessary with other change work, I think in equity, you have to define what you mean by equity. I think there are a lot of terms that are used in this space that don't really mean much, like, buzzwords and bullshit. Like right. There's a lot that just doesn't mean anything. And so I certainly think that is defining what it means for the organization, because, right. So I talk about in the project, like representational equity, distributive equity, procedural equity, but that may not be applicable for all organizations. And so I think that was one thing that I think is really important, that may not be applicable to other spaces. But you're absolutely right. They are very broad. In my experience, and I've been at a couple of organizations doing this work now, I'm trying to be kind. There are having those kind of administrative kind of change management theories are really helpful, because a lot of state organizations kind of struggle in that space, right? So I think having that strategy and that lens is really, really important. Thank you. That was a great question. Oh, can we ask one more? Just one more. Thank you.
That was a fabulous presentation, Nicole. I did notice, near the end when you were talking about the stages of grief, you rightfully recognize that equity work and the goals of these strategies are extremely emotional work. Anywhere in your frameworks did you kind of include, I know that, dealing with resistance is dealing with emotions, but emotions are so common. Is there any kind of plan in the framework to handle the emotions that come up?
That was I struggled with that, to be honest with you, because that's something that I think is really important to address. And I will honestly say that I did not deal with the emotions in this project. I kind of wanted to stay not away from it, but really kind of uplift that supporters are needed. And that's how you deal with your emotions, right? Is you have people kind of in your corner building you up. That is certainly something that would be great for further research. And I will kind of put this plug in that my project is definitely a living document, and I want all folks to come in and chime in and let's like redo it and all the things and make it better. I'm certainly going to be working with the Natural Resources Agency on talking about this project, but also just what does it look like in practice.